Welcome and thank you for joining BIE's most recent in a series of D&I webinars. I'm pleased to be working alongside Owen today as the leader of our diversity inclusion agenda, and he'll be chairing today's session. For those of you who don't know BIE, we're an executive recruitment firm focused on helping our clients drive change through a mixture of senior leader placement, change and transformation. At BIE, we feel that the executive search industry has a key role to play in assisting clients drive diversity through their hiring processes. We've taken a stand to take action rather than just words, and as a result are focused on our own internal learning, becoming the most inclusive employer we can be, whilst also hosting these kind of events to help provide education on a range of topics and raise awareness. The active hiring we do for organisations can help drive more diverse demographics for our clients. However, the discussion today is around continuing to learn how we can all become more inclusive. Owen, over to you.
Thank you, Gordon. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, delighted to be with you today, facilitating today's discussion around the topic of disability. This is actually the fifth in our series of D&I webinars that we've been hosting over the last couple of years on various topics like allyship, LGBTQ, creating a trans-inclusive workplace, and our most recent one on social mobility, which I certainly found very fascinating and thought-provoking. As Gordon mentioned, D&I is a focus for us here at BIE, so we're really delighted to be able to bring together some great speakers today and have this discussion. We fundamentally see D&I as a pillar of fairness within our business, but also within the businesses that we work with to support. Today's panel will help us to better understand disability and sort of what it means for us, how it's defined, what we can do to attract the widest and best possible candidate pool into our organizations, and how we can all enable all employees to thrive at work. Our two panelists are experts in their respective fields, and they'll be sharing some fascinating and inspiring stories from their own lives. Today's discussion will last around 45 minutes with some questions, introductions, and then there'll be plenty of time for a Q&A at the end and hopefully get through some great questions coming through from the audience. We'd ask you to submit your questions either on the chat function or the Q&A function if you'd rather it to be more anonymous, and we'll endeavour to get through as many of these as we can at the end. You may note at the start, today's session is being recorded, and we plan on sharing this out with you afterwards, along with a write-up of key takeaways from the discussion. I'm now going to pass you over to our two speakers, and I'll let them introduce themselves. They'll do a better job than I will. And I really hope you find today's discussion very informative. Diane, I might ask you to start.
Thank you very much, Owen, and it's great to be here. So I'm Diane Lightfoot and I'm CEO of Business Disability Forum, which I will say a bit about in a moment. I've been at BDF for about 5.5 years, and before that I spent 13 years as a director at a learning disability charity. So I've been working in this space for over 18 years now. Business Disability Forum is a non-profit membership organisation, and we support businesses of all shapes and sizes to get better at recruiting and retaining and developing disabled employees, and also to serve disabled customers. We were set up over 30 years ago. We now work with over 450 organisations, and half of those are global businesses, whether they are truly global, the likes of HSBC or Unilever, or whether they operate in some markets, and they cover private, public and voluntary sectors. But the majority are big businesses. So they are the big banks, they are Amazon, they are Microsoft, they are Sainsbury's, IKEA, Coca-Cola, and many, many more. We estimate that they employ about 20% of the UK workforce and around 8 million people globally. And we support them very much as critical friends. And I think I put the emphasis very much on friend. So we take the view that if a organisation wants to work with us, kind of wherever they are in thinking about disability inclusion, then we'll engage with them, we'll support them to get better. And so our approach is about providing very, very practical support and advice and tools that really work for business. And that's kind of our niche, really, that we work at the intersection of business, disabled people and government. So as well as providing this very practical support and advice through our advice service, through resources, networks, task forces, events in the days when we're allowed to have real life ones, we're trying one out next week, we also use that really rich evidence base that we get from talking to our members to feed back to government and policymakers around what works and crucially what doesn't as well, in terms of being really practical for employers. And our approach is very much whole organisation. So not sure of the profile of who's joined us today, but we believe that getting it right is not just the domain of HR and D&I teams, wonderful and important though they are, but it needs buy-in right across the organisation, from senior leaders to line managers, to procurement teams, to IT, to premises, to communications, you name it. So that's a bit of scene setting about me and about us, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Diane. Jay, could I ask you to give us a brief intro of yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, and BAE for having me on this webinar. I hope to get to pronounce your name properly by end of this. I'm a big cricket fan. Owen Morgan is one of my favorite players, but I still can't say his name properly. Okay, so if I mispronounce your name, apologies at the outset. Okay?
I think he has really helped the pronunciation of my name in this country. Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you for having me on this webinar. My name is Jay Muthu. I am currently the Director of People and Org Capability at Entain. So Entain is a FTSE 50 business. We are in gaming, sports betting, and interactive entertainment. So I've been at Entain for the last 10 months or so. In my role, I'm responsible for all things talent, leadership, learning, diversity, inclusion, culture, and employee engagement. Before coming to Entain, I was in a very similar role leading talent and engagement and diversity inclusion at Virgin Media and at Thomson Reuters and Randstad. Those are some of the organizations I've worked in. I'm originally from India, but now living in the UK for the last 7 years, almost, 7 years now. And why am I on this webinar? You're probably thinking, okay, so I am a lifelong, I had polio when I was 1.5 years old, so I have never walked. And as I've grown through my life, I've realized that walking is too overrated. Why walk when you can roll, isn't it? So I roll on my wheelchair everywhere. I've had a reasonably successful career if you kind of measure success through promotion and amount of money you make, etc. And I'm also hoping that I've also created impact in the organizations I've worked. I keep joking, one of the legacies I leave every organization, hopefully I've left some good work legacies, but one legacy I always leave are automatic doors in the offices I work in, isn't it? I go in and I see there are no automatic doors and I get them fit. Okay, so, and that makes life easy for everyone, not just for people on wheelchair or people with disabilities, you know. So that's my background. I obviously have been very passionate about diversity, equity, inclusion in the big. I started getting into this space around 10, 11 years ago when I was at Thomson Reuters. Thomson Reuters was a fantastic organization which was very progressive in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion. So I learned my ropes there and I've continued to do that. But I'm particularly passionate about disability at the workplace. You know, in corporate large organizations is where I'm really passionate about, because we all know the influence large global organizations have in changing the discourse in the society, isn't it? And we need to start bringing disability into the discourse as well. That's what I do. And I try and do as much as possible from a positive role modeling perspective, because I'm sure there are lots of disabled kids or young people out there who probably don't see people like me or people with disabilities often in positions in large corporations, isn't it? Okay, you see people working in the third sector, you probably might see some influencers on Instagram or people who are, you know, activists, but you rarely see people, at least I've not met, I've been to so many conferences and events, I've never met someone who's disabled at a senior level in an organization. So I firmly believe that positive role modeling is important, because you can't be what you can't see, isn't it? And that's why I'm here today, to kind of really talk about disabled talent pool being a very important talent pool in today's world, and how organizations need to tap into it.
Brilliant. Thanks both for that good introductions. And I think you'll agree, hopefully, that we've got, I guess, both of you coming from different perspectives in today's discussion. So I think that'll be sort of an interesting piece to bring through today's discussion. I would like to share a little Slido poll that we will have running throughout the discussion today, to get interaction from you, the audience, if you'd like to participate in this. We just have a very simple question, which we'd be keen to get your thoughts on, and we'll share back the answer as we get through later on in the webinar. But we just would like to know, have you thought about people with a disability as a talent pool when you're hiring for your business? As we're sort of coming into a tightening labour market, and we're looking for increasing talent coming into organisations. If you'd like to interact on this, just go to the Slido website, slido.com, and there's a hashtag there where you can enter BIE. But it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on that and see what your organisations are doing from a disability perspective, if anything. Diane, I'd be keen to maybe get your thoughts initially, if you could help us sort of almost frame our thoughts around disability. What is it? How do you define it? And sort of, are there any statistics or that you can share into it?
Well, it's massive, and there are loads of stats. So a lot of people I talk to haven't really thought about disability and are just starting to immediately think about physical disabilities and wheelchair users. And that's understandable, because the recognised symbol of disability is usually a person in a wheelchair. And it's also important, as it's pretty ridiculous that we are halfway through 2022 and we still don't routinely design buildings and public spaces to be accessible. So it's wonderful that Jay has a legacy of automatic doors, but wouldn't it be great if we just routinely put them in the first place? But anyway, actually, wheelchair users are a minority of disabled people, about 8%. And the majority of disabilities, over 90%, are not immediately visible. And I say not immediately rather than invisible, as it may take you a moment to notice that somebody has a hearing aid, for example. And this 90%, to illustrate again the breadth of the term disability, also includes people who are neurodivergent, so people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. I said that, I usually can't. Autism, ADHD, a stammer or Tourette's, for example, those are all neurodivergent conditions. And also people with mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety. One of my interests in this is that I have long-term depression, but you probably wouldn't know that unless you meet me on a very bad day. And people with long-term conditions like cancer, MS, HIV, diabetes, and many more. So one of the things I always say to people is that you probably already employ, work alongside, and know socially many more disabled people than you realise. So that point that Jay was mentioning about role models, and you can't be what you can't see, is really, really important. And I think probably one we'll come back to a bit later in this conversation. And another popular misconception is that disability is present from birth. And in fact, only 17% of disabled people are disabled from birth. 83% acquire their disability, and I'm told the average age of acquiring a disability is 53. So this is critical to workforce retention as well. And you wanted a definition. So it may surprise you to learn, or maybe not, given what I've just said, how broad the UK Equality Act 2010 definition of disability is. And it's a physical or a mental condition which has a substantial and long-term, and that means over 12 months, impact on your ability to do normal day-to-day activities. And if you're in a global business listening to this, then the United Nations definition is the most widely used and accepted. It's very similar, but it's longer. Having told you that, I'm now going to say, don't get hung up on a definition. It's all about enabling everyone in your workforce to thrive. And also remember that not everyone who meets that definition will identify as disabled or even use that word. So I think the really important focus is this is about talent. And that's so important in the current climate with massive skills shortages in so many sectors. And I think this might be my sort of final stat for now, or I might throw another couple in, who knows. There is this massive untapped talent pool. So in the UK, only just over half of disabled people of working age, 18 to 65, are in employment, as compared to about 82% of their non-disabled peers. So that's a massive opportunity to recruit. One other myth to bust here. I know that employers worry that it will cost more to support disabled people. And one of the big global organisations we work with carried out a bit of research in-house to look at this. They found that the average cost of making a workplace adjustment, so a change to how someone works, whatever that looks like, the average cost to retain someone who acquired a disability was only 7% of the cost of rehiring. And that doesn't take into account all those organizational knowledge and skills that you lose. So I think this is really, really important when it comes to myth busting, and remembering too that most adjustments are not costly and many are free. Pre-COVID, if we can remember that, working from home was the most frequently requested workplace adjustment. So I hope that helps with a bit of context and myth busting.
Brilliant, yeah. Thanks for giving some context there. Jay, I'd be just curious to see, from your lived experience, I guess, how, what Diane was saying there, how does that reflect from your line of sight?
Absolutely. And I think Diane shared some wonderful and brilliant and insightful statistics, isn't it? People don't understand how vast the world of disability means. So if you look at what the World Bank says, there are at least 1.2 billion people with a disability in the world, okay, some form of disability. And if you want to understand what 1 billion could be, it's almost like the population of India, isn't it? So it's one of the largest, the second largest country by population, if you were to add that. People know statistics like Facebook is the third largest country in the world or the largest country in the world, but disabled population is so big as well. And it's also important to really understand, especially when you're talking of how do you define disability. Lots of organizations believe that if I do like put a ramp or get a person on wheelchair into the organization because it creates a visible fact that you've done it, is a great starting point, because sometimes that's probably the easier thing to do. Whereas as you go into the complexity of disability, maybe there are more things which organizations need to do, isn't it? So the way I want to look at disability at the workplace, I don't want to add to anything what Diane said, because she's really articulated the landscape. But I want to really address the point of looking at this as a talent pool and as a culture lever, isn't it? So if, for me, diversity, whether it's gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, social mobility, is all about talent and culture, because this is a talent pool, and a talent pool which some organizations have tapped into and have found tremendous value, and lots of organizations have not looked at disabled people as a talent pool, but have viewed them as a corporate social responsibility thing. Let's do this because it's the right thing to do. But if you start looking at a talent pool, the benefits you get are tremendous, isn't it? No, as a person with disability, I can say this, I'm sure every disabled person are able to focus on things they do well, really well. Okay, they kind of cut out the noise many a times and they do what they need to do really well. Second, because as Dan said, nearly half of the disabled population, at least in the UK, don't have access to opportunities, and probably even worse in some other countries. Once you are able to give an opportunity to someone with a disability, the level of loyalty is quite high. In all the organizations we had worked, when we hired disabled people, their level of attrition was almost half the level of attrition of able-bodied people, for example. So you get that. And three, I think what really does is the notion of inclusion changes dramatically in organizations. When you have few disabled people, people start not from day one, but over a period of time, people start automatically thinking about how do we include the disabled people, but also in the same way, how do we include people who are different to the majority, isn't it? So that starts helping building a better culture in the organization as well. So for us to really create that culture where inclusion is truly there, but also to look at disabled talent pool. Even when I say 1 billion, it's a large number. I'm sure the wide array of complexity in disability means even if 40% of that 1 billion were a talent pool, imagine what we could do if we start focusing on really employing those people at the workplace and the value it could bring in, okay? And more importantly, we also have to remember from the customer perspective as well when it comes to disability. This 1 billion people plus their family and friends, so if you add another 2 extra people for all of these people, okay, that's 3 billion, isn't it? And they are the consumers of products which organizations deliver. So no organization, no company in the consumer space can really think about not thinking about disability, okay? Because you know the impact if all disabled people decide to boycott a particular product because they're non-inclusive, you're talking about 3 billion people in the world boycotting something. So that's powerful, isn't it? So that's where organizations need to look at it, not just from a talent and culture perspective, but also from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's taking all the different angles into it to get those different points of view. I suppose just even thinking about, I suppose, points of view and almost taking a step back a little bit as well. Diane, I know you spoke about neurodiversity, and I guess then you've also got physical disability, or maybe you were talking about, you know, some being more visible than others. Is there almost I don't want to say risk, but is there a risk that certain parts of disability maybe become more spoken about, or more of the day in terms of, you know, sort of people's awareness on them?
I'm sort of in two minds around this one. So we've really seen in the past couple of years, neurodiversity massively coming up the agenda, and much greater awareness of, you know, the scope of that, how it manifests, how to support people, and are actively seeing quite a lot of the members that we work with wanting to recruit neurodiverse talent. That's fantastic. But only if it is not at the expense of the wider disability agenda. So before neurodiversity became the highest profile bit, I think, that we talk about, and it pretty much is, mental health and well-being was very much coming up the agenda, and certainly during the pandemic that's been a critical focus. And again, I think that's a good thing, as long as it doesn't mean that the aspects of disability that never sort of become fashionable, if you like, don't get overlooked. So I was discussing this with some colleagues, and we were saying, you know, things like chronic pain and fatigue, they don't ever, or certainly not yet, become sexy, and that they are massive issues that really impact on people's everyday lives and employment. So I think that awareness of the kind of more granular aspects is great, as long as the whole isn't forgotten. And quite often, so we work with all these members and partners, and many of them have disability networks or employee resource groups, and lots of them are thinking about how they name them. So whether they just call them disability, or now disability and mental health, or disability and mental health and neurodiversity. And so it's a very live discussion about how this sits. I think as well, it's really important, and no one here is implying this, just to be clear, that we don't create a hierarchy around disability, because that's really unhelpful. That kind of narrative of, I'm more disabled than you are, therefore I'm more sort of worthy. And that happens sometimes. So we really need to make sure that we don't do that, and we give everyone an opportunity to thrive. Equally, I mentioned the statistics about the disability employment gap. we also need to dig beneath those headline figures, because that 50 or 52% figure of disabled people in work in the UK masks the fact that for some groups of people, the figures are much, much lower. So the very lowest is people with a learning disability. It's less than 6%. And equally for people with conditions like cerebral palsy, severe and enduring mental illness, it's also very, very low. So I think we need to hold those two things in balance, embrace the greater awareness and celebrate the fact that we're learning how to support people and encourage them to thrive better, but not forget the bigger picture and those sort of less fashionable bits, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, yeah. And I think, Jay, just sort of on that, and as well, thinking back to sort of some of the discussions we were having with you recently, I think you mentioned that at a previous company you were at, there was a different sort of stream in terms of sort of thinking about disability, with some thinking from I suppose the physical aspect and the rest from more of a neurodiversity aspect. Is that something you've seen widespread in organizations, or was that a particularly large organization that maybe had the capacity to maybe break it down a little bit more?
Yeah. So I think when we were talking about employee networks, to Dan's point around, do you create a disability network, a mental health network, a neurodiversity network? In one of the organizations I was at, we took a conscious decision to focus on disability separately and neurodiversity separately, okay? And the reason for that choice was, when you kind of put everyone together, there is no focus on anyone, isn't it? You know, you bring everyone together, suddenly the neurodiversity takes importance because it's a new thing, and the physical, the hearing impairment, the visual impairment kind of takes the back seat. Or like she said, if you look at the hierarchy, because having someone with a white cane walking around the office next to someone on a wheelchair is a good picture for employer branding, isn't it? Okay, so does that become a more important hierarchy? So we decided we need to focus on both of that. So let's kind of invest our time and effort in trying to understand what disabilities challenges people have, and how can we recruit and retain talent in that space, but also look at how do we introduce neurodiversity and the language of neurodiversity into the organization, because it was the first step we were taking. And even the concept of neurodiversity is a very, maybe a very UK terminology at this point in time. Not many countries really understand that, isn't it? So we really wanted to educate our colleagues and our leaders around that. That's why we went separate. If you were to ask me, is that the right way to go? I personally think yes, okay? Because I think by doing that in two different methods, what you're kind of creating is one, focus, and two, you're also letting awareness build in both these areas. And ultimately, when you look at the broader organization, I'm sure we will talk about intersectionality. Somebody can be neurodiverse and physically disabled and still be homosexual, isn't it? Okay, so we need to really look at it differently at the bigger picture. But if you want to really focus and make a difference, if you think your organization, there is a big stereotype, isn't it? Neurodiverse people thrive in software development, for example. So if you are a big technology organization, if you want to focus on neurodiversity, I think it's good to kind of focus on that, because there is proof that neurodiverse people can be quite capable in that space. But if you want to do both, I think having two separate focus streams is probably better from a corporate perspective, if you have the resources and you are large enough to do that.
Yeah. Interestingly, both of you as well, just before we sort of move on a little bit further, both of you brought up the notion of language there as well. And maybe what we discuss, neurodiversity might be a new word for lots of people. Are there maybe sort of from a language perspective, and just to sort of help our audience today, are there terms that maybe we should begin using or use more around sort of the broad topic of disability? I don't know if either of you maybe have specific thoughts on that.
I'm happy to go, Dan, if you...
Yeah.
Okay, so I think in the last couple of years, the whole language around not just disability, but around diversity has become more and more important, isn't it? And sometimes the discourse in society and media, mostly social media, which you should not be on, but if you're on, you get a barrage of those, isn't it? Okay. Sometimes people tend to forget the original problem and focus on the language. Okay. Yes, it's important not to use derogatory language. Like, for example, I'm sure in the past, disabled people were called invalids, isn't it? Okay. And you'll not believe this, London, global city, 2015, I think. Okay. I was in one of the tubes and one of the trains on the underground, obviously crowded Jubilee line thing. And somebody was trying to get in, but obviously my wheelchair and me took more space in that carriage. So someone behind me said, there is an invalid inside, okay? So you can't come in, okay? So this is 2015, isn't it? So that kind of language obviously needs to disappear. People need to definitely try and understand, what is neurodiversity, for example, or do you call me a wheelchair user or do you call me a disabled person? Do I personally care? No, isn't it? Okay. But don't call me, specially abled and, man with superpowers, nothing. I've got no superpowers, isn't it? Okay. So I think that's important. One, let's not use condescending, derogatory terminology. Okay. And if you don't really know the terminology, it's quite okay for you to ask questions to people. And that's where organizations really need to help our colleagues to learn the language of disability or diversity in general. I'm sure there is a huge debate around when you talk about gender identity and sexual orientation. What do you call people nowadays, isn't it? There's such a big vociferous debate. But sometimes those debates kind of take the sheen of the real agenda which you need to drive. So I personally, in the organizations I work in, it's important to teach people inclusive language. But if someone makes a mistake because they're either clumsy or they don't understand and they're still trying to learn, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Okay. That's the view I kind of take. And I don't want to focus too much on the language and everybody getting everything right, because it's not possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think I've unfrozen now. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Completely agree with Jay, and it's something that comes up a huge amount in conversations with the businesses we work with. So we usually say, focus on intention. And if you genuinely ask people and you speak with the genuine intention of getting it right and listening and getting feedback, then that's really important. And also remembering that a lot is very individual. So in the UK, we tend to use the social model definition. So we say disabled people. Other people and other countries prefer people first language, so people with disabilities. So just asking people what they prefer is really important. And I think don't be so afraid of saying the wrong thing that you say nothing, because so often that's what happens. People are so worried about getting it wrong, and they see a disabled person, either an employee or a consumer, and they just think, I don't want to get it wrong, so I won't ask. I was speaking on a panel with somebody who is also a wheelchair user, who was saying that when he's in the supermarket and he wants to get something off a top shelf, he can see people looking at him. But when he says, could somebody give me a hand? Everybody rushes to help because they're happy to help, but they don't come up to him and say, can I help? Because they're worried about causing offense. So just saying, what do you need? How can I help? All those sorts of things. Don't be afraid to do that. We also, I should do a small plug here, we have an inclusive communications toolkit at Business Disability Forum, which probably tells you how important that is as a subject. But yeah, be brave to try, as one of our members said.
Yeah. Well, perhaps we can sort of share that, or share a link to that maybe with people afterwards as well, because I think some of that could be quite interesting. Just sort of thinking of disability within the context of sort of broader equality, diversity and inclusion over the past number of years. I guess with diversity and inclusion becoming something that companies are increasingly talking about, is there, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. Where do you see disability sort of coming in within that? You've already mentioned, other aspects of it, gender, LGBT, ethnicity, etc. where do you see disability, or is there, I don't want to say is there a hierarchy here of sort of priorities within organizations, but almost is there?
I'm happy to go. And if I'm being a bit provocative, and if the audience feels a bit squirmish, please do. Okay, I'm not going to apologize. Okay, so
let us know.
Yeah. So there is definitely a hierarchy in organizations when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, isn't it? Okay. Dan used the word different things in the disability world become sexy, okay, at different times. But if you look at the macro picture, at least in large corporations, the world I inhabit in, disability has never become sexy, isn't it? Disability as a whole has never become sexy. Obviously, there is a, rightly so, there is huge focus on gender. There is reasonable focus on LGBT, but we have to agree that LGBT inclusion goes beyond cupcakes during Pride Month. Okay, cupcakes and changing your logo on LinkedIn. It goes beyond that. Are you truly inclusive? There are horror stories from lots of organizations around the LGBT inclusion space as well. The unfortunate incident of George Floyd 2 years ago, I think, created a groundswell movement when it came to racial equality, and especially the black, the issue around black diversity in corporations. Lots of organizations jumped on the bandwagon, changed their Instagram handle to a black screen, okay, and they thought they'd done the right thing. Okay, and we've not really seen progress happen. When you look back in the last 2 years, every organization has hired a diversity inclusion leader. Many of them have left those jobs as well, okay, and gone to other organizations because they've got disenchanted. So that became the George Floyd incident became the tipping point for race and ethnicity. Unfortunately, I hope it's never caused by an incident like George Floyd. We've not had the George Floyd moment when it comes to disability, isn't it? Organizations have never really focused on making disability a huge priority when it comes to talent. They do that from a corporate responsibility kind of perspective, but they don't do it from an inclusion and diversity perspective. Now, I'm sitting here as the person responsible for D&I at Entain, and hand on heart, we've not focused on disability as well. Okay. And in spite of me being there and trying to bang the drum over the last 9 months, we still haven't had that level of interest in the organization to focus this as a talent pool. And that's been the case in many organizations as well. So now I go back to the earlier point in the introduction, what Dan mentioned. Organizations need to think about disability, because we all know that your gender for the vast majority of people is assigned at birth. Your ethnicity is mostly defined for you. Okay, your sexual orientation, again, for the vast majority of people is defined, but disability could happen to anyone, isn't it? And when that can happen, just imagine a situation where, I hope it never happens, okay, one of your senior leaders in the organization gets disabled due to an accident or some illness or something. Things will change in that organization, okay? And that's where today the movement around disability is based on individuals. It's not based on an organization strategy, okay? Microsoft, I think, has been one of those organizations which has done some phenomenal work in the last 4 or 5 years, both from their product perspective, but also from their organization perspective around disability. And a large part of that was due to Satya Nadella, the CEO, and his lived experience of having a disabled child, okay, which led to that change, isn't it? And today, Microsoft, and they did that, but they still went on to triple their market share, okay? So if people think it's expensive to invest in disability inclusion programs, it's not, okay? And people just need to start thinking about disability as a strand within their diversity strategy and not as an afterthought.
Yeah. Diane, do you see similar? You're obviously talking to a wider variety of organizations as well. Are you seeing similar things to what Jay was said from sort of the Entain and his sort of lived perspective?
I think so. disability still gets parked in the too difficult box. So going back to what I was saying about people worrying about getting it wrong, so not doing anything, it's too often still seen as too sensitive, too political, too tricky. But as Jay says, it's the one strand of D&I that can affect any one of us at any time. It's part of the human condition. And if we were going to go on a sort of philosophical journey with this, I almost wonder if that's the reason people don't want to think about it. But anyway.
It's interesting what you're back to your statistics at the start. You were talking about what, you know, in disability, sort of it's what 17% have maybe some sort of disability from birth, but the rest, as Jay has said as well, can sort of technically maybe happen to anyone.
Absolutely. And so Jay was talking about Satya Nadella at Microsoft and his experience of having a child with cerebral palsy that obviously completely changed his perspective. In the same way, and this shows the importance of senior leaders, we do a lot of work with HSBC, and their UK CEO, Ian Stewart, is a fantastic advocate and campaigner within the bank for disability inclusion. And that's due, I'm sure, in no small part to the fact he has 2 adult children who have disabilities. And so he's seen some of the barriers that they face in a sort of similar-ish sort of way. If you're aware of Page Group, their CEO, Steve Ingham, is also a massive disability inclusion advocate, having had a very serious skiing accident a couple of years ago, which meant he has become a wheelchair user. He has completely lost the use of both his legs. And it doesn't need to take something like that, because we can all be allies and we can all start noticing and listening to people's stories. A more positive bit on this, I think 2 years ago, or more than 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, I was really braced for businesses we work with saying, you know what, disabilities inclusion is important, but we've got so much going on. There's a pandemic, there's this, there's that, there's Brexit, you name it really, and it dropping down the agenda. But actually, we've seen the opposite happen. And we've seen many more businesses coming to us because they've realized that they can recruit and work differently and more inclusively and more widely, and recognizing that for many industries and jobs, crucially not all of course, they can be done from home, which opens up massive opportunities for people to work differently, different locations across geographies. And also,
do you see working from home and the ability to work from home, which is, as you say, grown over the last number of years, as something that will and can help more disabled people sort of come into the workplace and sort of help people sort of build their talent pools as well?
Massively, absolutely massively so. It's not a panacea. Not everyone can work from home, has the setup for it. Not everyone likes working from home. So it's important to remember, you know, there are some jobs that you can't do from home, and some people, the isolation and the impact on their mental health is not good. But lots of people who have, say, conditions to do with fatigue or pain or medication, or who just can't get accessible transport near where they are, or find accessible housing that is anywhere near where the workplace is, it's been a game changer. They can suddenly work very differently and flexibly in a way that suits them. So as we navigate what kind of, let's be positive and call it post-pandemic looks like, really holding on to that and remembering the gains and being person-centered, to use a bit of jargon, is so important, because for many people it's been an absolute game changer.
Ian, if you don't mind, can I come in for 1 second?
Sure.
I totally agree with Dan's view that the fact that work from home has become sort of a norm for many jobs today, at least white collar, desk-based jobs, okay, is a great opportunity for organizations to start looking at disabled talent, even if they want to wet their feet, isn't it? You know, they've never hired someone. This is an opportunity to kind of do that and then see what goes on. But the other thing which I also wanted to kind of call out is the pandemic has impacted lots of people, lots of demographics in various ways, isn't it? Okay. But one of the demography which has probably got impacted quite negatively has been the disabled community as well, okay, with some of the rules the government had around do not resuscitate and all of that kind of stuff. And even like if you look at London, you know, I'm someone who lives in London, I commute to work where I can, when I can, thanks to our very inaccessible underground system. Okay, but the excessive focus on no traffic zone. So like today, there are half the places I can't take a taxi and get off somewhere. Okay, yeah, and I'm talking about someone who's fairly able-bodied, at least from upper body perspective, can afford taxis. Okay, and public transport, when it's not inaccessible, I can't get off because the government thinks we should have cycling lanes all over the world and nobody else should be kind of doing it. So the society is also taken a step back when it comes to how do you really incorporate disabled people into the day-to-day. Okay, the number of parking bays which were available for disabled people has disappeared in the pandemic in many cities and many town centers as well. So things are changing, but there is this silver lining that the fact that for white-collared, desk-based jobs, people can do it from home. So we need to kind of look at that positive, but also see how large organizations need to start influencing policy to change some of these things. How do you make transport accessible? How do you make sure people can get to work when they need to get to work?
Yeah. No, that's it's interesting from your, I suppose, more lived perspective as well, Jay.
Yeah.
I suppose just on a sort of practical level there as well, we've already talked maybe about some things that organizations are doing, and Jay, you mentioned even sort of automatic doors in your business, but sort of on that practical level, what else can organizations do to improve that sort of access for disabled people in their businesses?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to kind of take, because I also straddle the world of recruiting and talent and everything, isn't it? Okay, so for me, wherever we've done some good work in embracing disabled talent has been when we've had a big advocate in the business. You've got to identify one or two people in the organization who are ready to take the leap of faith. You need that support system. As much as HR and D&I teams can push it, you need someone in the business to do that. So identifying one of those people is a good starting point. The second thing to do is, how do you go to market, from a talent attraction, employer branding perspective? How do you really create visibility that you are an organization which is welcoming of people with disabilities is very critical. Okay, and that kind of needs to go through the recruiting process as well. Sometimes it's just one statement in your job ad, isn't it, which says, if you need any special accommodation during the selection and interview process, please do let us know, and then we will make it possible. Even adding that one line, I think, is a game changer. Early in my career, when I was looking for jobs when I was in India, that used to be the one thing I used to look for before I went and applied for a job. Okay, so for a lot of young people getting into work, I think this could be very, very important to kind of say. So even doing that is a statement to put out, and it doesn't cost anything, isn't it? Okay, and if you have some people who kind of say that they need a slightly bigger interview room if they have a wheelchair, or somebody to escort them from the main door into the interview room if they're visually impaired, is very, very important. And then sometimes you also probably need an expert to come and create the conditions of success when you're doing this for the first time. Okay, I'm sure there are lots of organizations, including Business Disability Forum, I'm not sure if they do that, who can come and advise you on what you need to do to, one, make it easy for them on day-to-day work, but also how do you help the colleagues around them to do so. Talk to an expert. None of us have all the answers, isn't it? Talking to experts is very, very important. And the last bit around adjustments, where people request for adjustments, there are lots of avenues to achieve that as well, because what you think somebody might need is not what everyone needs. So again, working with organizations who are experts in identifying what adjustments people need. And I can say this, if you're a small organization who thinks, okay, if I need to buy a screen reader for someone with a visual impairment, it's going to cost me 500 quid, and I probably don't have that in my budget. There are lots of ways the government provides funding for some of that. There is a good scheme called Access to Work. If you can get through the DWP hoops, okay, if you're patient enough, but it works, isn't it? Like I use Access to Work to commute in a taxi because there is no public transport available for me to where I need to go to work. So it is possible. So organizations can tap into some funding from the government as well. So there are avenues available for you to do it. But my request is take the risk. Yeah. The way to look at it is, I'm sure everyone on this call, when you hired your talent, not all 100% of those have turned out to be great hires, isn't it? Okay. Not all 100% of them have turned out to be the best people you could have hired. So if you hire someone with a disability and do it well, it might 95% of the chance it will work well. A couple of times it may not, but then we live and learn.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I was going to ask a question around sort of broader culture and bringing senior leaders in, but actually I see one of our questions coming in through the Q&A function is sort of on that as well. But it's, how do you bring CEOs on the journey? You can find lots of other passionate people that want to work on the topic, but often maybe you don't get the most senior leaders in organizations having those conversations and learning from these people. And in a way, it's probably a little bit back to Diane. You mentioned allyship as well. That's sort of linked in there, I would say. But what are your thoughts on that or advice on that?
I think picking something that resonates with them, that links into their agenda. So if they are really worried about skills shortages in recruitment, then that's an angle. If they're really worried about retention, then that's an angle. But the more you can build up allies to get to the CEO, the better that is. And certainly having a senior champion, even if it's not the CEO, but at the next level down, that can then connect actively with your disability network, if you have one, and provide a conduit up, and crucially a conduit back down, because that kind of loop about you fed this back in and this is what's going to happen as a result is absolutely critical. And if I can sort of expand on the culture piece, because I also saw a question about why prefer not to say is so prevalent in for the disability question. And I think this is this whole thing about culture and about psychological safety, which is quite a recent buzzword. Some people love it, some people hate it. But this thing about feeling safe enough to share is so critical. So we did a survey 3 years ago now, we're repeating it this year. We called it the Great Big Workplace Adjustment Survey. And it was statistically very robust. We had about 1,200 responses from disabled employees across a wide range of businesses. And one statistic that really sticks with me is that 34% of people who had a disability who would have benefited from a workplace adjustment, 34% had not asked because they were worried their manager would treat them differently. And the figure was almost the same for people who were worried that their team members would treat them differently. And I quite often say to people, do you know how many disabled people in your workforce? And if they think it doesn't matter, well, where is people's energy going? I hear so many stories of people who are working around or covering or masking, which is exhausting. So just one recent one, a story of someone who'd confided in the diversity and inclusion lead that had not told her manager that she was completely deaf in one ear. And it was a hot desk environment. To manage that, she was coming in and making sure she always got a desk next to the window, so that her deaf ear was next to the window, so that no one could come up and approach her on her deaf side and surprise her and her not be able to hear. And I spoke to this D&I lead who was really worried that this employee hadn't even told their manager. And I said, does she come in very early? And she did. And we were sort of discussing, imagine the amount of stress she must be under, worrying every day about getting that desk. And yet, for whatever reason, she did not feel able to say to her manager, hey, by the way, I'm deaf in this ear. Could I have this as a fixed desk in a hot desk environment as a reasonable adjustment? Which is a perfectly reasonable thing to ask and should be just dead easy. And yes, of course you can. She didn't feel able to do that. So this is where this role modeling and senior managers talking about disability, utilizing rather than normalizing the conversation, sharing personal experiences, and going back to this piece about how many disabilities are not visible. If you have a disability that's not visible and you're senior, you can probably make your own adjustments. You can get your fixed desk. You've probably got your own office. You can work from home. You can probably do whatever you like without having to go through a process. But the more that senior leaders actually say, the reason I work from home 2 days a week is because actually I have chronic fatigue, or who say, oh, well, the reason I was off for a month or so isn't because I had an operation. I actually had a breakdown. The difference that makes in making people think, yeah, okay, I will say is huge. And just going back to the questionnaire as well, there's a massive what's in it for me factor. So if people think that answering a question about disability might lead to setting up something tangible like a new network or a new workplace adjustments process that is going to meet their needs, something that is a benefit that outweighs the perceived risk. But it's a long journey to build that up, but it's vital.
Mm. Is there something that employers most commonly get wrong, maybe, when thinking about disability?
How long have we got?
Oh.
5 days. 5 days
Yeah.
intensive. I think some of the things we've touched on, like not understanding the breadth of disability and also not involving people in developing processes. So one takeaway from this is kind of inclusive design. And I don't just mean buildings, though Jay's illustrated that beautifully with the automatic doors, but also policies and processes. Because even people who, managers and leaders who are designing things with the best possible intention, they don't know what they don't know. And I really believe that no one wants to be in the situation where a wheelchair user arrives at a building and actually can't use the lift, because even though there's a lift, it's not big enough for an electric wheelchair because it's designed on a manual one. Mm-hmm. And so maybe the biggest message is involve your people. So when you're doing anything new, get the widest possible group to tell you what you're missing out on. There are tons of things when it comes to recruitment as well. Jay talked about adjustments and just asking every candidate, how can we make this be the best possible experience for you? You don't have to second guess whether someone's got a disability. You're just enabling people to thrive. And making sure that your portals, your systems, the way that you're getting people to apply to you is accessible and get people to test it. And that means accessibility to software like screen readers. Mm-hmm. So get that tested. But it also means making sure that you haven't got automatic sifts in there and algorithms that automatically reject people who say, I've got a gap in their CV or haven't got a certain qualification. So this is where that whole organization approach comes in. Talk to your IT people, your procurement people, just make sure they're not building in biases just because they're using their own experience. To illustrate this in a sort of slightly silly way, I was talking to one of my colleagues recently about the countdowns at crossings. I think they used to call them pelican crossings. So you know the ones where they go green and then automatically you seem to have 5 seconds to race across the road. Yeah. And we were saying, if you have mobility issues or even if you're not 18, how do you do that? And she was telling me that the test for the time taken was based on young men, fit young men at university. So that was the test. And that's why, for so many of us, it's like race across. If they, in that test, they said, okay, let's involve people of different ages with different mobility, wheelchair users, you name it, that wouldn't be a problem. So
maybe a little bit linked to that as well. We've got another question coming in from Mark Murray, but he was asking sort of what can be done to limit unconscious and even conscious bias in organizations, you know, on their journey towards potentially hiring people with disabilities.
Yeah, it's, you know, obviously the unconscious bias or conscious, I call it conscious bias, isn't it? You know, is not restricted just to people with disabilities. It kind of goes across all spectrums of anybody who's not a majority, isn't it? You know, you just can't say white man. Let's not paint the white man to be the source of all the problems. Not at any majority. You know, if the moment you're talking about a minority, there is a problem around unconscious bias. What can you do? You know, you can educate. You know, you absolutely can educate your colleagues. And that's the first thing we need to kind of get into. If you're thinking of doing a broad DEI agenda, educating colleagues around the importance of difference and what value the difference brings in is very, very important. And the difference is not, people say, I only look for cognitive diversity. I don't really care about how people look. But the difference and the value people bring with lived experiences is much, much higher than, I went to Oxford and somebody went to Cambridge, so we are different. Okay. So I think we need to move out of that zone and think about lived experiences. And when you talk about lived experiences, then it's important to have, white people, Black people, Asian people, gay people, disabled people, etc. So it's important to do that. The second one is it's a big culture thing, isn't it? Once you've educated people, given some people some time to embed it, how do you then deal with behaviors which are contrary to that? One of my favorite quotes about culture is, your culture is defined by the worst behavior you tolerate, isn't it? Okay. So how do you kind of make sure that when people are not behaving in an inclusive fashion, one, you talk to them, you educate them, you coach them, but when the behavior continues to fester, what do you do and how do you make that an example in the organization is very important. Okay. And the third one is, how do you continuously give space for people to be able to either openly or confidentially share situations where they're not, and what have you done about it? So one of the things which we are exploring launching at Entain is it's not your typical whistleblower hotline, which all companies have from a compliance perspective, but almost like a confidential helpline where people feel if they've experienced discriminatory behavior, hopefully not non-discriminatory, discriminatory behavior, they can call in, and then we have a record of that, which then helps us to kind of define culture. It's not about targeting the person who did it, but to really understand what are the symptoms in the organization which you can address. Does it get fixed in a quarter? No. Does it get fixed in 2 years? If there is good sponsorship and commitment from the senior leadership, it does. Okay. But if you're really committed to it, this culture change will kind of really happen over a 3-year period, but you really need to stick to it, isn't it? And not say, culture change should never be a fair weather friend. Okay, when the company is doing really well, let's think about culture change, or when it's not doing really well, do it consistently. And then organizations will become open. This is a cliche, but I'm still going to use it. Lots of people think by focusing on diverse talent, be it any denomination, not just disabled people, you are reducing the merit of the meritocracy in the organization. That's not the case, isn't it? Who defined meritocracy? Okay, meritocracy needs to be viewed from different perspectives. When, I said I'm not going to tarnish white men, but if you hire 3-4 white men in a team, nobody says that somebody is being biased, isn't it? But when you hire 3 disabled people in a team, and if I were to hire 3 disabled people in my team, guess what they'll say? Jay is biased, okay, because he's disabled, he's hired 3 things. So it's very important for us to think differently. Diversity is not about lowering the bar, it's about widening the door. In some cases, literally widening the door, isn't it?
Yeah, I think all really good points. And we've got some more good questions coming in as well. We've got to some of them already through the chat, but another one, just what is your advice on the pushback of everyone needing to be assessed in the same way through the same recruitment process, even though the process and the assessment criteria might be barriers? Specifically maybe thinking about neurodiverse people, is there sort of a need to have like a typical recruitment process and then maybe a slightly separate one for people with people of neurodiversity? Maybe Diane, do you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I have seen examples where companies have specific neurodiversity hiring streams. I think it has to be a choice. So the feedback from this particular organization was that some of the candidates loved it and some of the candidates said, well, why on earth can't I go through the usual process? So I think far better to make sure your processes are genuinely inclusive. And this goes back to testing the right skills for the job. So traditionally, we still have traditional panel interviews, don't we? And we expect to have a whole load of questions that we haven't seen in advance, a panel we haven't met in advance, to be put on the spot and to feel like we're going to be caught out. I would argue that that doesn't really showcase anyone's skills to their best unless that's the exact job they are going to be doing. So if they're going to be in a sales role where they need to combat people coming back with all sorts of objections, that might be the ideal test, or obviously if they're going to be a barrister or something. But actually, most jobs, that's not the reality of it. So if you've got a technical job, why not get people to show you how they would do the job rather than tell you about it? So getting someone to actually do some coding for you, if you've got a technology job, is a far better measure of how good they are at coding than asking them to tell you about the best piece of code they ever developed and why they're so proud of it and what they learned. I mean, I'm being slightly glib there, but you want to actually test what they can do. And some of the things that, again, get typically put into interviews, time limited tests. So I suspect that where this question is coming from as well is that neurodiverse candidates, so particularly candidates with dyslexia, may well need and ask for extra time. But consider whether actually the time test is something that is relevant to the job. Do you need that, or could you have it untimed for all the candidates? Another one that comes up quite a lot that is quite controversial is giving people the questions in advance, which can make a massive difference in reducing anxiety, say for autistic candidates or anyone who really worries about interviews. And unless, again, it's a job that is about testing people's powers of recall, actually, if you reframe it and say we want to get the best out of everyone, and this is about your experiences, then please come prepared to talk about ABC. Why wouldn't you do that? So I think really thinking about why you're doing stuff is absolutely critical. And that doesn't mean you can't assess people, but that gives a much better picture. And to go back to Jay's piece about how many people have we employed that haven't worked out in the past, of those, how many have done the most brilliant interview but not been terribly good at the job? So really think about what you're testing would be my main advice.
Yeah. And just to add, in today's interviewing world, someone who can tell a good story with zero skills could get a job, but then get found out very quickly. We've all had that experience. I'm sure BIE, you have had some candidates like that. Even you might have had some candidates like that, isn't it? Okay. So it's important to really look at why do we need to do what we need to do. This is not about saying, let's not, okay, here comes somebody with autism, so let's just hire them. That it's not about that, isn't it? Can we tailor based on the job they're going to do what we need to do? And that's where recruiting teams need to think differently as well. So start small if you're thinking of doing something like this.
Yeah, I suppose that's interesting. I just see a comment coming in from Chloe as well around, probably a little bit linked to that, around separating the recruitment focus between physical and mental disabilities. And sort of if that was possible in a smaller company. So it's all these things don't have to sort of start from large.
Yeah, no, and I think don't worry about that. If you say to each candidate, I mean, the technical term is to say at every stage, don't ask about disability. That's not a lawful thing to do, but say, do you need an adjustment, or how can we make this the best possible experience for you? And give examples as well of what you might be able to do. So things like more time for a test, or coming into the premises for a physical interview, or meet the panel online, or whatever it is. And have the confidence as well to be able to deliver on it. One of my favorite stories, I'm sure it's true. CJ, I'm one of those people that can tell a good story and then we'll get found out. I'll get found out after this. So I heard this story, I'm assured it's true, of a hiring manager in a business who got contacted by a candidate coming for an interview who said, I need an adjustment. And this manager panicked, didn't know what to do, went to their manager and said, we've got a candidate who needs an adjustment. What do we do? And their manager panicked. And eventually they went to HR and said, we've got a candidate who needs an adjustment. What do we do? And eventually somebody in HR said, what's the adjustment? And they hadn't asked because they were afraid of getting it wrong. So they went back to the candidate, and I'm promised this is true. It was a candidate who had a visual impairment, and she wanted to let them know she'd be bringing her guide dog and to ask if there could be a bowl of water for the guide dog. In terms of adjustments, that is pretty simple, but it could have been make or break between her coming for interview and having a shot at that job.
Yeah.
So I think don't get too hung up on it. It's certainly not about trying to diagnose people or separate people or second guess. It's just, if you have the mindset, we want every candidate to show themselves at their best. What can we do to make that happen?
Absolutely.
I'll take one last question that I see coming through here. Just thinking about surveys, maybe within organizations, what's your advice in capturing the disability data of your organization?
Again, we are grappling with something like that, not just disability data, but also diversity data in general, isn't it? So the holy grail of data when it comes to diversity is always a challenge. If you look at most organizations, at least where I've been employed, the level of people who declare their diversity, whether their sexuality or gender identity or disability on the official HR system, is quite negligible. Okay, unless the organization has really created a sense of psychological safety, etc. But without having the data, you really can't do what you need to do to kind of change the culture and etc. So one thing which we've tried we tried that at Entain, I tried that in my previous couple of other jobs as well, was when we do our employee engagement survey, okay, because it's anonymous, we request people as the starting point or at the end of the survey to declare their diversity demographics, not just disability, okay? So this, at Entain, we asked 2 questions around the disability space. Do you consider yourself having a physical disability, okay? And then we gave a list of things like, physical disability, hearing impairment, visual impairment. We spoke to some experts and got that list. And then we also asked a question around, do you consider yourself having a neurodiversity, and gave a few options for people to choose, and also gave a free form text, okay? Mm-hmm. And there we end up getting more responses, okay? Mm-hmm. So at least 85% of our colleagues declared whether they have some form of diversity, isn't it? Not just disability. So the number of, I think in our system, there's probably 4 people who've declared they have a disability, okay, including me, okay? And but when we did the survey, I think we had nearly 4 or 7%, I think, who declared they had some form of disability, okay? So sometimes that data is good enough, isn't it? Yeah, we can't really do specific stuff for Jay or for John or for Sally, but at least we know there are people who have this. So when we start thinking about design of any process, policy, program, we start thinking from that perspective that there are 7% of people who might need something different. So let's look at it.
No, thanks for that, Jay. Talking about surveys, our own little survey that we asked the audience to complete today, just thinking around, have they thought about people with disability as a potential to increase the talent pool when they're hiring into their business? And actually 82% came back and said yes. So we've obviously got a lot of people who are on the ball when thinking around this topic. I guess the question then that I'm thinking we should ask next time is, have you actually actioned that, or is it just still a thought? Yeah. But we'll let that for another day. It's good to see that the thinking is going in the right direction. As we conclude, Jay and Diane, I'd maybe ask you for a 10, 20 second, one little snapshot of advice that our audience today could take away from, from thinking about disability.
Oh, shall I go first then?
Go for it.
Okay, so I think rather than saying why would you, move to why wouldn't you? If somebody asks for adjustment, instead of thinking why, start from why not. And if somebody communicates, behaves, performs in a way that you're not expecting, what's out of character, before you jump to conclusions, just take a step back and think, is there something else going on? And ask them if they're okay. And that will open up a completely different conversation.
Thanks. Anything to add, Jay?
Yeah, from my perspective, disability is a complex world. None of us are experts in that. Your HR and your D&I teams are not experts in that, but disabled talent is a huge talent pool. Start small, learn from the experts, get advice from external people, but don't put it off. Next time you create a slide with 4 pillars around diversity, make sure you add a 5th pillar on disability as well.
Brilliant. Well, look, that just leaves me to say certainly thanks to Jay and Diane for your time today. I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody else attending today has also really learned. Thank you for really giving freely of your time and sort of sharing your thoughts and knowledge on this topic. On that note, our next D&I webinar is coming up and planned for October, specifically around the time of menopause, World Menopause Day in the middle of October. So we're sort of thinking of having a topic and discussion sort of as close as possible to that date in October. So watch out for that coming through your diaries. And as mentioned at the start, we'll be sharing a recording of today's event, probably slightly edited down, with a little bit of write-up as well. So watch out for that coming through to you as well. But no, thank you all for attending. Thanks to Jay, thanks to Diane, and have good weekends all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.